So this week, my wife and I are going to be on vacation, and we won't be able to pre-record our live show just because of time constraints. So what we have available to offer to all of those who are interested in new churchy kind of stuff from Kindred UMC is this is a sermon that I delivered on video for our sister church in DeLand, Florida, called Collective. So you'll hear me reference Collective, and Ben is the pastor over there. But you know, if you haven't seen it, you might like it too. So I hope you like it. Here it goes. Hi, so I'm Chris Hayden. I'm the pastor at Kindred UMC, and Ben has asked me to deliver the sermon this week, and it's a distinct honor and privilege, and I don't get the chance to actually preach typically very often anymore. Everything we do is kind of interview format, so this is a little weird. It's the first time I've had to do it in camera, so, you know, I'll try and pause for laughter because I'm hilarious. So that's a good example right there. So we're going to look at this text from Matthew, and it's not easy. It's hard. It's a hard one. So this is from the book of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 34 through 39. It goes like this. Do not think, this is Jesus talking, by the way. Jesus is talking to his disciples, his 12, his close disciples. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. So, oh, my Bible's falling apart. It's been with me a while. So, that's some cold shit, right? That's not the Jesus that I am familiar with. He's saying some really hard things here. And so how do we make sense of that? Like, how can we reconcile this Jesus with the Jesus who is also Prince of Peace? He literally says, I haven't come to bring peace, but you're the Prince of Peace. And right before this, he says, whoever denies me, I will deny before my Father. And then later we're going to read when Peter is in his most crucial moment of faith, and he denies Jesus 3 times, and then later Jesus forgives him and brings him back and in fact lifts him up to a pretty important level of authority within the first early church. So we have all these weird contradictory kind of ideas going on here. And so the first thing that, in order to kind of understand what's going on, the first thing we have to do is just kind of let go of any need for this to be totally, literally true all the time. It just doesn't work that way. The Bible doesn't work that way. I mean, you can't even get past the first 2 chapters. I need a table. You can't even get past the first 2 chapters without running into contradictory statements. Like, when did God create humanity? Was it after everything else, or was it before everything else? And it's well, if you read chapter 1, it was after everything else. But then if you read chapter 2, it was kind of around everything else. So let's just let go of our need to do that. Let's let go of our need to make all of this make sense. All those who call on my name will be saved, Jesus says. And then later in Revelation it says, not everyone who calls on my name will be saved. That's not the way the Bible works. Let's abandon our need for that to be the case. All right? That's not how it works. So now we can just kind of look at what the heck Matthew is saying, because Matthew is the writer. And it's not like he was there with Jesus, taking intimate notes and being let me make sure I get this quote right. That's not how the Bible works either. Matthew was written decades after Jesus even died. So
this is a guy who has an agenda. This is a guy who's like trying to make a point to a specific kind of audience. And the audience that he's making the point to in his whole book, he's trying to convince this mostly Jewish audience that this guy Jesus is the one that they were promised, this Messiah Savior figure that was coming. And so in the midst of his gospel, as he's putting words in Jesus' mouth, he quotes from another book, Micah. And that's a book that a mostly Jewish audience would have been at least slightly familiar with. They would have had some kind of an understanding of like where that book was, or like where that book was written and why and to whom and what it was addressing. The other thing too is like not just that broad context, but the specific context of like what just happened in the story before this. Like why is Jesus even saying these things to his people? So let's just talk a little bit about that. Jesus is talking to his close followers. And before any of this happens, Jesus is going on, he's like on a miracle tour. He's like making the lame to walk and the blind to see, and he's casting out demons. And that's great and wonderful and very helpful for the people who, need that kind of thing. But Matthew's actually doing something a little deeper by telling these stories. You see, all of those things, all those ailments, all the problems that people were having, it was believed culturally at the time that those things would have been caused by sin. In fact, there's a story where they come across a blind man and Jesus' disciples are like, why is this guy blind? Is it because he sinned or is it because his parents sinned? Because we know it's one or the other. Like, this guy's being punished. He was blind because he did something wrong. And then when Jesus goes and heals that blind person, he's not just healing the blind and saying like, see, I'm God, I can do magic tricks. Matthew's saying that what he's doing is he is actually giving Jesus the authority to forgive sin and to like have the authority to speak into how much you owe God or not. And so Jesus goes on this miracle tour, but the miracles are about Jesus forgiving sin. Now, here's why that's important. I mean, obviously, like, it's important. Like, it's just on its face value, it's important. But here's some cultural reasons why it's important. One of the ways that the people in power kept power was through shame and through their specific understanding of sin. So like, if you don't want to be blind, if you don't want to be crippled, if you don't want to be whatever, I'm not sure if that's like an acceptable word anymore. Forgive me if it, I don't know. But if you don't want to have ailment, then you have to listen to us, you have to give us, you have to sacrifice to us, you have to buy our sacrifices so that you can sacrifice to Yahweh. And so there's this power structure that's rooted in shame and sin and avoiding the consequences therein. And Jesus goes on this miracle tour where he is undermining all of that. And he's essentially saying, you're not blind because you sinned or your parents sinned. Like, here, I can prove it. And then he's healing people, and he's like casting out demons, and he's doing all these things that are subverting the people who have power. And then it comes time for him to send out the close people that have been following him, that have been studying from him, his disciples, because he's a rabbi. And so his disciples have been literally following in his footsteps, learning to do what he does. And he finally comes and says, like, all right, guys, it's time. And this is what's happening. The thing we just read is his big speech to like it's his pregame locker room, like, all right, we're going to get out there and we're going to get him. And that's what he's saying here. And so I was a worship director before I was a pastor. I did music, and I worked with a youth band, like teenagers who were like still kind of learning their instruments and stuff like that. And they would often have stage fright. They would get really nervous before we went on to perform. And if we did especially if we did like special shows, not just for the youth group, but like if we went to some other church and there was going to be like more people there that we didn't know, like it was really nerve wracking. And so I used to always gather, and there's one girl in particular, I remember, Gabby Kiavanza, if you're out there, shout out. And she would would get nervous, and I would gather her and with everybody, and I would say, all right, listen, Gabby, we're going to go out there. We're going to do our best. And I want you to remember, everyone's counting on you, and if you make a mistake, we're all doomed. They're all going to laugh at us. We're going to be embarrassed, and people will probably stop believing in God. People will probably lose their faith, all because you didn't do it right. And we would laugh because I'm being ironic, and that's the relationship we had, and I'm, of course, being sarcastic. The whole point of that was to kind of point out how ridiculous the pressure we put on it, it's not that big of a deal. If you play a wrong note, you're going to play a wrong note. Nobody's going to lose their faith. Nobody's going to burn in hell because we screwed up or something like that. So Jesus kind of gathers his people together, except he's doing the same thing unironically. He's being very intense about what's at stake here. And he says to them things like, if they hate the master, they're going to hate the servant. You're going to go out there and it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be terrible. Don't expect it to go smoothly. If if they didn't like me, they're sure as hell not going to like you. And then he kind of ends all of that big pep speech with this statement about, I haven't come to bring peace, but the sword. I came to divide mother against daughter and man against father and all the things he said. And so he's kind of giving them permission to be confrontational. Because there are some things in life that are more important than peace. So the Micah thing. Micah is a minor prophet. And in this speech, Matthew has Jesus quoting from the book of Micah. And the whole point of Micah, it was written 800 years before this book. And the whole point of Micah is it's written during a period called the exile. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with the Bible, but bear with me if you've heard this before. I had to pay thousands of dollars for somebody to tell me this stuff. So the book of Micah, it's 800 years before this one, and it's a minor prophet, and it's all about the people who have been exiled. So Israel at that point had been conquered by Babylon, and Babylon had this particular tactic where they would basically transfer all of the population in their conquered city to their home city. So all of the Israelites, or not all, but most all, would be literally marched to Babylon, and they would be forced to migrate to a foreign city. And the reason they did this is because it's the best way to conquer an enemy. Because Israelite children who are born and raised in Babylon, are they Israelites or are they Babylonians? And so it's this particularly brilliant and also brutal and horrific way of completely erasing a people's culture. So they could defeat their enemy in a generation or two and not have to worry about anybody growing up and taking vengeance on them. Now, that's why there's a lot of the Old Testament, and even to this day, I think it's a serious part of Jewish culture that's remember, write this on your doors, your door jams, and teach your children, and make sure that we keep our culture alive. Make sure that we know who we are, even though we're in this foreign land, even though we're away from Jerusalem. Make sure we know who we are, and that's why we have practices like the Passover meal. This idea that when we eat this item from the meal, it's reminding us of the stories that make us who we are, and it's all rooted in this conquered, exiled people. So Micah's written during this exile, and he's making the point. The whole book of Micah is about the reason that we're being exiled is because we failed to hear the cry of the needy. We did not feed the widows and the orphans. We instead used power and wealth to elevate ourselves, and we failed to do the thing that God asked us to do, which was to take care of each other, and especially to take care of the people who are oppressed and who need things the most. So Jesus, he's sending his disciples out to go on this All right, now it's your turn to do what I've been doing. Don't think that it's going to be nice, because what you're doing is going to subvert people who have power. And if they didn't like it when I did it, they're sure as hell not going to like it when you do it. And when you go out there, I want you to remember that I sent you not to make peace, but to confront power, to confront wealth, to confront the haves who are not sharing what they have with the have-nots. He's giving this pep talk that's like, don't fucking expect it to, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that or not. Don't expect it to be peaceful. Don't expect it to be easygoing. There are things in this life that are more important than peace and politeness and keeping everything comfortable and okay. When I was just out of college, I'm in my 20s, I was having a shindig at my apartment, and it was going to be like a mixed crowd. And so there was going to be like, I went out dancing, and so I was going to have like dance friends come. And then I had like old high school friends who, because I was still living in my hometown, and so they were in, and they were going to come. And then I was going to have like, I used to lead worship at this Baptist ministry, and some of the Baptists were going to come. And then I was a Methodist, I was a member of a Methodist youth group in a Methodist church, and some of them were going to come. And so there was this really hodgepodge kind of mixed crowd, which can be fun. I mean, like that can be a lot of fun, because then people make new connections, and you stumble upon new topics of conversation, and it's, you know, it's fun. It can also go the exact opposite. It can also be very like tense. And it's like dancers and Baptists in the same room. Like, I hope they don't, let's not talk about it. You know, like theater kids who are mostly like, you know, queer and poly, and that combined with like the Methodist churchy people who have been taught like you don't even look at a girl until you know you want to marry her, and things like that, you know. So it could be tense or it could be nice, and we'll see what happens. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but one of my friends started to tell a joke. And it was one of those jokes where about halfway into the joke, you could tell where it was going, and it wasn't going in a good way. It was going in a bad way. And long story short, the end of the joke was like overtly, blatantly racist. Like, it was just like, whoa. And everybody in the room just kind of went, ha, 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 like you do. And then we all kind of, without even saying a word to each other, collectively agreed to just like move on and let's never speak of this again. Like, let's just keep the peace and move on. Everyone except for one person. He was my best friend growing up. He was the son of a Methodist pastor, and he was burned by the church, I would say, he and his family, and so he wasn't too keen on religious people in the first place. And of course, the person who told the racist joke happened to be religious, you know. And I remember to this day, like, this friend of mine, after he heard this other guy tell the joke, he looked me in the face and he made eye contact with me. And after a moment of just silence and like held eye contact, he then turned to the guy who told the joke, and all he said was, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Racism is never funny." He didn't smile, he didn't laugh, and he made an already uncomfortable situation exponentially more uncomfortable for everyone. He had taken what we had agreed to keep hidden and quiet and in the dark, and he grabbed it by its neck, and he dragged it into the light where everyone could see it, and then he dropped it there where it could die publicly. I didn't come to bring peace, but the sword. Sometimes the gospel has an edge. Sometimes it has an edge. There was a friend of mine years and years ago. He was an older guy. He was a church member. He was telling me the story about this procedure that he was having. It was kind of a routine procedure. and he was locally anesthetized. So as they were operating on him, he was like conscious and he could talk and see and kind of was aware of things. And some technician had left the sonogram on accidentally, and it wasn't even supposed to be on, but because it was on, somehow they figured, and don't quote me on the details because it was years ago. So if you're an actual medical professional and you're going like, that's not how that, I'd probably have some details wrong. But there was some machine on, and that allowed them to see that this guy was about to have like an aneurysm that was going to kill him. Like that. And so he's conscious for this. He can hear the doctors and the surgeon and like everybody kind of like, oh, what? Oh, what's that? And then what they do was they don't have time to like knock him out. They don't have time to do anything else. They literally just cut into him, and the doctor reached his hand in and like stopped the aneurysm somehow. This guy's awake for this. It was violent. It was painful. It was hard, but it saved his life. Sometimes the gospel does this. Sometimes the gospel is violent and tearing and has an edge, a sharp edge that cuts, that wounds to heal. There are lots of things I think that all of us have that we would prefer to keep in the dark. Whether it's behavior that we're ashamed of, or something that's been done to us, or an abusive, traumatic history, or, I mean, you like fill in the blank. There's just you could just tell all kinds of stories about all kinds of things. And in my experience, those things, when they're in the dark, tend to drive our ship. They tend to steer our truck. They tend to like have the wheel when we don't want them to have the wheel. And then we find ourselves saying things we don't mean. We find ourselves acting in ways that we would no longer tolerate if someone else acted that way. Like we find ourselves doing things that are not how we imagined we would be. And it's because we want to leave those things in the dark. We want to keep the peace and stay comfortable. And this aspect of the gospel, and this is not the totality of the gospel, but this aspect of the gospel that has an edge, that wounds to heal, that divides, that cuts. This aspect of the gospel invites us into the places that we would never otherwise be willing to go. Because it's in those places that we have buried and that we keep secret, even from ourselves sometimes. It's in those places that God, the surgeon, the divider, the cutter, can work. And I can confess to you that for a long time, I did not want to go back to my abusive childhood, to my trauma that I suffered as a child. And I ignored it for a long, long time until this old Pentecostal church lady, her name's Pat, and she saved my life. And she walked with me into those places and invited me to go back to that little boy who was scared and afraid and knew that God wasn't going to help him, to go back to those places. And it was painful, and it hurt, and it was scary, and it was violent, and it was just awful. And it brought healing. It brought wholeness, because I was willing to risk losing my life, to take up the cross, which is shame and humiliation and violence and pain. Because I was willing to take those things up, God gave me life in the midst of them. So, I would ask you, what do you think is more important than peace? Maybe it's confronting people who say terrible, awful, harmful things. Maybe it is undermining the authority of those who would use it to oppress others. Maybe it's simply admitting to yourself that you've been hiding and running from a demon, from a trauma, from an abuse, for a long, long time, and it's time to finally shed the tears and grieve. Maybe it's something I haven't even thought of. But I know this for sure, that there are things that are far more important than keeping the peace.